Thank you, Juliet, for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful, extremely important conversation today that is honestly past high time for our field. To begin, it is important for me to acknowledge and recognize that I am a settler on North America, which the Lenape, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee call Turtle Island. I was born on the land of Tongva peoples, and today I stand before you on the unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape, whose descendants are the Delaware tribe, the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. This land remains the traditional territories of these peoples, and it continues to carry their stories of struggle for survivance. Additionally, I recognize that I am not Indigenous, and I do not claim Indigenous knowledge or theory as my own. I can only speak for how I have learned from Indigenous teachings and how to be a better ally and endeavoring to be a welcome guest on Indigenous land. I was asked today to talk about Indigenous theory and how it can aid in our conversation on the decolonization of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. So instead of appropriating Indigenous knowledge to prescribe ways of decolonization, I will aim to provide thoughts on how all of us non-Indigenous folks can be better allies through listening, consent, and knowing our limits as settlers. Colonialism is a project that is never complete. As long as Indigenous peoples and their stories continue to haunt settlers, it is a reminder of this fact. Colonialism and settler colonialism, more precisely, seek to eliminate all Indigenous peoples physically and discursively in order to replace them with colonizers. If genocidal killings do not solve the problem, colonizers remove them to the outskirts of settler colonial society, such as removing the Lenni Lenape peoples from this land that we now call Philadelphia to places like Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario to disconnect their heritage from their ancestors. In addition, Gene O'Brien, a scholar of Ojibwe descent, reminds us to be wary of how Indigenous peoples are also written out of history and colonizer memory, leading towards colonial narratives such as the disappearing Indian. This is what colonialism does. It strips away people from their land and the stories away from memories of Indigenous peoples and colonizers alike to justify colonial occupation of land and their continued denial of sovereignty to Indigenous peoples. Decolonization, then, is not only a land-back project, but it's also the complete return of sovereignty, and it is the complete dismissal of colonialism, its logics, and its institutions. In their famous paper, Eve Tuck, an Unganak scholar, and Wayne Yang, a settler scholar, assert that decolonization is not a metaphor because there is a concerning trend in the academy to take up decolonization as a hot topic and to conflate decolonization as a synonym for diversification, justice, and or liberal equality. In their words, they say, quote, "When metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness. It resettles theory. It extends innocence to the settler. It entertains a settler future. Decolonize, a verb, and decolonization, a noun, cannot easily be grafted onto pre-existing discourses or frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks," end quote. In addition to Tuck and Yang's work, scholars from the Pacific Islands, Asia, and Africa remind us that decolonization is for all Indigenous peoples who are subjugated by settler colonial states. Therefore, decolonization does not stop on Turtle Island. Decolonization concerns all Indigenous peoples from Turtle Island to Siberia, from Aotearoa to Saint-Mi. So, what are some concrete steps that we can take as settler colonials to become better allies, or as Jessica Hernandez, a Beniza and Maya Chorti scholar suggests, becoming welcome guests? First, and most importantly of all, Listen to indigenous voices. What is indigenous leadership saying to settlers on how to help their cause? Listening to their stories, listening to and acting on their calls for action. This is the first and most important step. Indigenous-led movements on Sahaland, on Chukchi land, on Tuva land, and many others are speaking up against the colonial violence that is perpetrated by the Russian state, such as harsh censorship, imprisonment of indigenous activists, and domestic policies that disproportionately affect indigenous peoples. Just like how in the North American context, indigenous-led movements stood up at Standing Rock to resist the US-backed Dakota Access Pipeline and fight continued dispossession of land. Second, asking for consent as a critical aspect for decolonial praxis. Indigenous peoples have been taken advantage of for the sake of scientific advancement for white people. Indigenous languages, ways of being, ways of knowing, and their belongings and cultural productions have been taken as objects of curiosity by settler colonials to bring back to their colonial institutions to be consumed as exotic representations of primitiveness. They were never asked for consent for these studies. It was assumed by settler scholars that they could take whatever they wanted from colonized peoples, and that indigenous consent would be a hindrance for scientific advancement. Additionally, this direct type of dispossession is not limited to social sciences or research that directly involves indigenous bodies, but it is also encompassing of their intangible productions, like knowledge, theory, and history. Citing and engaging with indigenous scholarship and not appropriating their thoughts for settler means is critical for this framework of consent. A move towards decolonization means a move away from colonial research models that continually dispossess and towards models of consent that return sovereignty. Asking for consent and creating and maintaining good relationships is key to Jessica Hernandez's idea of becoming a welcome guest. As she quotes her grandmother, who says to her, quote, "Never forget that anywhere you go, that is not your home. It is someone's home, and you must pay respect and build relationship with the land and the people to become welcomed into their home. Otherwise, you're walking in their home as unwelcome guests." And the last point I would like to share today is to know your limits as a settler scholar. As non-Indigenous peoples, we are limited in our scope to understand the continued violence used by colonial states to dispossess Indigenous peoples. Therefore, there are many issues that we plainly cannot speak on with care. So in accordance with the practice of an ethics of care, one must know when to stop talking and return to listening. Acting within your limits, however, does not mean to do nothing. It means you must take into account all three of these things that I've laid out today, and among many more, and put them in dialogue to critically think about your positionality. As colonialism has recently reared its ugly head in public view again, it is important now more than ever to remember that decolonization is not a metaphor. It is the liberation of Turtle Island to Siberia. And to summarize this point, I want to end my talk today with a poem titled Maps, written by my mentor, Jenny Davis, at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who is Chickasaw writer and a scholar. This mole, that I prefer to think of as a freckle, is the exact shape of our tribal jurisdiction. Beware. Irregular borders are a sign of cancer, and these passing wagons hide melanoma blankets. Our skins map colonial histories, love stories. Colonial histories retold as love stories. Thank you.
In future years, I want to see the work of the decolonization being taken up as not a metaphor, because like I said, there's some panels here today that are using it as another way to say diversification or as like justice or equality, when it really is about indigenous peoples and giving back sovereignty, giving land back, giving, having them have bodily autonomy and so on. This, it's not just another form of diversification. So like, let's say a syllabus, right? It's not about having another, putting one or two indigenous authors onto a literary syllabus, but it's about completely disregarding Russian literature as a enduring structure, because it doesn't have to be. And then knowing your limits is how knowing your limit is a critical part of this is while we are all learning from our indigenous colleagues, we have to know when we are not equipped to talk about it further, saying that taking a moment to reflect and saying, I need to learn more. I need to learn more, and I need to actually step back, and maybe indigenous voices have more to say than I do. So there are multiple layers to this, because there is the decolonization on the state level, right? So that is like the legal frameworks and everything. And then we have our academic level, where we're talking about it, how to decolonize from a theoretical framework, right? And decolonization kind of, it shouldn't be separate. It shouldn't be separate. It should be the same, because we can talk about decolonization in academia all we want, because I feel like not only is it a hot topic, that's why a lot of indigenous scholars are worried, but we can do this in academic spaces all the time, right? We do this all the time. And the next step is, how do we enact it? And that is through the activism and really forcing the state to recognize and create paths forward for indigenous, for decolonization and towards more indigenous futures.